Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Hassan, and I am so delighted to have with me people who are very dear to me. Getting emotional. Oh, it's just Bill and Lorna Goldberg are social workers. They're in New Jersey. They are stellar, wonderful human beings. They've been running the longest support group for former cult members in the country. Lorna was president of ICSA. You've been just amazing. And you were there when I had my cast on my leg 45 years ago. So I wanted to reconnect with you and memorialize the specialness of me saying there are people who've been doing this longer than me. You guys. So Bill and Lorna, please take it away. Give a little bit more about your background and interests and what you've accomplished. And I know you've done professional journal articles and trained people and done expert witness, all kinds of great things. Introduce yourself. Lorna, do you want to go first? Women first, Bill. Sorry.
Thank you. So 5 years before we met Steve, 50 years ago, my younger brother got involved in the same cult, the Moonies, and that took us on this journey in trying to figure out all the changes he was going through and how he wasn't himself anymore. Suddenly, our family was looking at someone who seemed completely different from the college student that we knew. Before he went into the cult, my brother had been at Penn, and he was involved in all kinds of protests. He was very much into music. He had his guitar and his torn jeans, and his hair was long.
Protest means against the Vietnam War, right?
Against the Vietnam War.
I was part of that generation, but younger.
Right.
Yeah.
So suddenly we were hearing that he was going on a mission for Moon to talk with Nixon. And he was, pro Nixon, which seemed to be so different from how he had been. He was suddenly very conservative, dressed in a suit and a tie. And, aside from the physical changes, we were seeing all of these personality changes. So we started on a journey to figure out why he had changed so much. And we started to learn about the techniques, that these groups were using. And
can I just ask, you were together as a couple when?
Yeah, we've been married for 53 years. So
that's my recollection. And it was your folks, Lorna, that were very active at helping other people too.
Right. And so, we talked to a lot of people, and we decided to take the step of deprogramming my brother. And it was very hard. My father was a member of the Civil Liberties Union, that we believed in free rights, but at the same time, we felt that my brother's rights, their son's rights were being impinged upon by the group.
Right.
What seemed to be a clear-cut issue of freedom was flipped, in that we came to recognize that he didn't have freedom. He didn't have freedom when he was under mind control, and that when the group, the pressure that the group put on him, although it was under the guise of religious freedom that we were struggling with, we came to recognize that real freedom came when he could recognize the pressure he'd been put under and how he had adopted these views because of undue influence.
Mm-hmm. And were you both social workers when he got in?
Yes.
We were.
So you were already mental health professionals.
Right. We already were. And
that's how we started the group, because as social workers, we wanted to offer something that perhaps other people didn't. Now there's many groups, which is wonderful. And there's a lot more theoreticians around. We didn't know what the bite model was. There was no such thing at that time. As the years have gone on and more theoreticians have come in and more academics have come in, and now there's college curricula, and now there's a recognition of the crossover between cultic studies and so many other issues, human trafficking, domestic violence, false memory syndrome, multi-level marketing. Some of the areas that I know you've been involved in, Steve, in helping people to recognize. There's also, of course, in our society right now, the phenomenon of conspiracy theories, and people are questioning, how can somebody get involved in these conspiracy theories that are so outrageous and seem so absurd? And it's because of the kind of research that has been done and the experiences that people have had with cultic studies that we have something of a paradigm now that can explain it.
Yeah. So can I ask you, this is unrehearsed, but what's your earliest memory of meeting me? Because my earliest memory was I had a cast on from my toes to my groin. I don't even have a photo of it.
I believe that Rabbi Davis was having some kind of program on Westchester.
That's exactly what it was.
And I have a good memory, Steve, of first meeting you in the parking lot, or maybe meeting you after the program, but we were outside the program and you had a big cast on.
I was on crutches, I'm sure.
And my heart went out to you because you hadn't been out that long. And you also were from the same cult as my younger brother.
Right.
And so over the years, I've always felt you as a younger brother to me.
Well, all I can say is it was just your hearts and your empathy and your compassion had helped give me hope. I felt so stupid and so ashamed and so embarrassed.
Yeah.
And it was people like you and Lifton later saying, actually, you know a lot more than I know. You should study psychology. It was
right.
That's exactly what I was thinking. That was at a time when we were learning so much, and we continue, of course, to learn from our clients.
Me too.
And we have to always be looking to change our perspective based on what's going on today. There's some core things that are going on that have been consistent in terms of manipulation, undue influence, and the human condition, especially with idealistic people who want to trust that other people are telling them the truth and who don't recognize all of the influences that go into making up our personalities. But the way that the phenomenon is manifesting itself changes over the years.
Right. Yeah, especially the internet just changed everything, and smartphones.
Yeah.
It was a total game changer. You know, I also want to just touch on, Bill, you love to do magic tricks and you have a great sense of humor. And for me, that was always a great teaching tool. Could you just say a little bit about that?
I used to do a lot of public speaking to schools, to churches, synagogues, youth groups. And I did my own bit of trickery at the time. I would be introduced as someone who has something interesting to tell you about. And I would say, I study how the human mind works. And actually, I told them, there's thoughts have wings, and there's ways of studying people and figuring things out. And let me give you some examples. And then I would do some mind reading acts.
Cold reading.
Cold readings. And when I sensed that the kids were really into this, I said, I would say, now, I would really like to take you for a weekend to teach you how to do this. You know, it's like building your muscles. Some people are born with more muscles, some less, but everybody can improve it. And would you be willing to come away with me for a weekend to learn how to read people's minds? And every kid's hand would go up. I'd say, oh, that's great, thank you. That's something that we can talk about later. But that's not really what I'm here to talk about. I'm here to talk about cults. And I'm here to talk about how people can get involved in a cult. And I would start to give my talk about some of the people that I've worked with, and how people that join cults, for the most part, are not seekers. They're not looking for something. They are normal human beings, perhaps a bit more idealistic than most, perhaps a bit more trusting than others, that are in the wrong place at the wrong time, because there's a group of people that can use common human traits and turn them against the individual, use them to manipulate people. And I tell them a bit about what happens in the recruiting of cults. And I say, I wonder how many of you, for example, would be willing to go away with a stranger who promised you something that was absurd. And how many of you would do that? And of course, nobody would raise their hand. And then I'd say, well, 20 minutes ago, you were willing to come away with a perfect stranger who told you something that was absurd, that you could read other people's minds. And I would then tell them how I did all of my tricks.
Yep.
I didn't want them to think that, you know, I was being closed-minded about it.
Right.
And as I would debunk all of the tricks that I used, and I would tell them why it is that people want to believe certain things, and why it is that people put their own doubting selves on hold.
Yeah.
So I felt that was a good way of helping them to see that it could happen to you.
Yep.
And I would always say to them, when you're approached by somebody who tells you wonderful things, and who tells you things that sound good, but they don't give you specifics, I hope that a little bell will go off in your head and say, that guy that I was listening to.
That guy, Bill Goldberg.
Right. He warned me about this.
Yep. So, inoculation is so important, and I'm not seeing a lot of preventive education programs for young people anymore.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But that's one of the most important things, I think, when you talk about inoculation, is a recognition that all of us are vulnerable. All of us, under the right set of circumstances, can fall for something. And skepticism, I consider myself a skeptic, and I know you are too, and Lorna is. Skepticism is a tool that's used in evaluating ideas. Skepticism means a recognition that all of us are vulnerable, that all of us will go along with something sometimes, even though in retrospect it didn't make sense, because we're human beings. It's a humbling. People think of skeptics as being arrogant, but it's quite the opposite. It's a humbling to recognize that any of us can get caught up in something.
Yeah, 100%. And if something's legitimate, it will stand up to scrutiny. And the burden of proof is on them to prove that it's right, not on us to disprove it. Because so many cult recruiters say, well, just come along, give us your opinion, but you're going to an isolated location or you're allowing an indoctrination, systematic social influence indoctrination to take place. And the myth of invulnerability. I'm too smart. I would never fall for that. As you say, Bill, the best thing is to have a humble attitude. Nobody's perfect. No one knows everything. But if something's real, it will stand up to facts and evidence.
And we all are vulnerable because as human beings, we can all be manipulated because we all have the same desires. We want to be nice people. We want to be intelligent people. We want to make a mark, if that's part of it. At the very least, we want to be seen as somebody who's willing to be open to new ideas. We just don't want to be so open that we'll fall for
our brains fall out. Something with the parachute. It's good to have it open. Lorna, I'm going to put the attention on you for a minute, if I may, and ask you to talk about. There are two topics I'd love to cover in our session, at least, and that is the kinds of symptoms you see in former members that you've worked, because you've done it for 50 years helping people, and then the other thing, both of you, to talk about what you want mental health professionals to know in terms of this population.
Okay, maybe the first thing is what I'd like them to know, the symptoms that that are common. That's part of it. You know, earlier in our conversation, Steve, you brought up the feelings that you had when you came out of the Moonies, and you were feeling embarrassed. You felt you were stupid, you know, that how could you be so stupid to let this happen to you?
Yeah, people told me it was a cult. How come I didn't listen to them?
Right. So it's so crucial for, and I learned this from Margaret Singer many, many years ago. Maybe that this was 40 years ago. I learned this from Margaret Singer, or maybe 45 years ago. But she said at a conference that first you deal with the person's cult experience, what happened to them in the cult, before you deal with their the personality per se or their early life.
I agree 100,000%. And I just want to say for our listeners who may not know who Margaret Singer was, she was a psychologist who was part of the Chinese Communist research with Lifton and Singer and West, Margaret Singer. And so she was one of the early pioneers who very courageously spoke out and just got a lot of cult attacks on her as well.
Right. And we were very fortunate, the old timers, to see the first generation of people who were knowledgeable in this field. As you said, Margaret was one of them, and she worked with Lifton, and she worked with Louis Jolly West, and they all worked in understanding what had happened to the American soldiers in the Korean War. Additionally, you know, my family was personally helped by Jack Clark, who
I knew Jack.
AFF, which was the earlier organization that became ICSA. So, and he was such a compassionate, dear person. I learned from him as well.
Yeah, I met him in 1977 when I came to Boston, and I'll never forget, he looked me in the eye, he said, "Freudianism doesn't explain cultism." And I was like, that's right.
So true. And in fact, you know, while in those years in the 70s, I had finished my social work degree, and I was going to a psychoanalytic institute. And I was teaching, you know, the way they were teaching at that time is that We don't want to impose ourselves very much on the therapy, and it's very important just to sit and listen and give the people a chance to come up with things. And then, I listened to Margaret Singer, who said, you've got to let these people know what they've been through and the techniques that were used on them. And I really learned that if you waited for people to talk who had come out of cults, they would project all these fears on you. They would bring to you very quickly, the feelings that they had about their cult leader, and feeling that you would manipulate them, they would be distrustful, and all of that. So I realized I had to work in a very different way
Right.
with former cult members. In addition to deconstructing the cult experience, I saw that there were other commonalities, the shame that people coming out of cults feel, and how they feel that they are failures in life. And some of it is an extension of a very harsh conscience that is developed in the cult.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very black and white, a very primitive conscience. And part of therapy really needs to be helping people become more compassionate with themselves, because
Yep.
cults have absolutely no compassion at all.
Yep. Or empathy. Right.
And then there was this grief reaction that people had, and particularly those that had been in cults for so long. So there was a grieving process of leaving, maybe not so much the cult, but their peers in the group, some of whom they were very fond of, but also the sadness about missing out on the life they would have had with their family. They missed funerals, they missed weddings. All of that played into a grief reaction. And as part of that, as Bill had mentioned earlier, we felt it was so crucial to have a group for former cult members because there were such commonalities.
Right.
And there also was a need to be with people that understood their experience and be with people who they could develop friendships with, because
Yep.
they felt so alienated and so different from the other people in the outside world.
Yeah, people feel really alone, like nobody else could understand my experience. And then you're listening to the person next to you, and you're like, holy mackerel, that's way worse than my, thing, and it's like, oh, wow, and then you hear another cult, another. This is where I learned about Scientology, the Children of God, Hare Krishna, all of these cults.
And it's the same, and they're all the same.
The behavioral patterns of breaking you down and building you up in the image of the cult, and the black and white all or nothing thinking, and the phobia indoctrination that terrible things will happen if you question or leave, they're the same. And that builds a perspective on your own cult. It's like, well, I may be going to hell, but they think they're going to hell because they left the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they think they're going to hell because they left, this group or that group. And then you start to realize there really are patterns.
And it's not always religious groups. What's amazing in our group is that somebody from a psychotherapy cult can relate to somebody from a political cult, can relate to somebody from a religious cult, can relate to somebody from a lifestyle cult. The phenomenon is the same. The ideology is different with each of them. The words they use is different, but the experience is the same. And that's one of the astonishing things. People in our group who came out of religious cults thought that they could never relate to somebody who would be involved in a therapy cult. But then they find out that they have those commonalities.
Yep.
When we talk about psychotherapists and mental health
Please.
professionals, one of the things that Lorna was alluding to, and I think is so important for a former cult member, to find a therapist who listens to you, who doesn't jump to preconceived notions, who doesn't in the very beginning say to you, well, obviously there's issues that you've had that you got involved in. Now, all of us have vulnerabilities.
Right.
It's helpful to look back on what your vulnerabilities were. But it was the manipulation of your vulnerabilities that got you into the cult. It was the fact that the cult broke the social bond.
Right.
And so a psychotherapist who is empathic, who listens, who might challenge you at times and point things out to you, but who doesn't tell you what your experience was, is what you need. It's helpful to have somebody who has some experience working with former cult members. I'm all in favor of that. But that's not the only criterion, or even often the most important criterion. The most important criterion is a therapist who listens to you and then draws conclusions and helps you to see things based on what you present.
I'm going to push back a little bit, if you don't mind, and just say, Bill, that I do think, like Lorna was saying about Margaret, psychoeducation is so important. And I keep hearing from people who've been in therapy for years, they like their therapist, but they're like, I'm getting tired of teaching them about my group. And the therapist hasn't.
I think there's other places that people can receive their psychoeducation too, from videos,
True.
from books, from groups, and that's certainly, I agree with you that somebody has to come to grips with how they were manipulated, but that's an adjunct to looking at how they reacted to the experience of being in a cult.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I respect and love you both, but I'm definitely more in the hard line. Like, if you are treating an addict and you have no training in addiction, you should be getting supervision and training or a referral.
I agree with you in that. I've offered, we do consult with therapists, but I think in addition to what Bill said, I would add that you would want your therapist to be a curious person. And if they're working with someone from a cult, having the desire on their own
Exactly.
to learn about the cult experience, that the client doesn't have to always be in the position of feeding them that material, that they would explore on their own because they're interested in their client, right?
Right. And one phenomenon, I just want to add this and then go back to you, Bill, that I am a representative of, is I was in a cult and I became a mental health professional. So we're seeing a whole new generation of ex-members who become professionals.
That is wonderful to know from the inside, what a person is feeling is a very lucky thing to have someone.
Yeah, and one thing that in my training, initially they said, you really stay out of it, don't share personal stuff. And I quickly learned people won't trust me. If I share my vulnerabilities and my journey, they'll feel validated and want to share more.
Right. Always in the service of helping your client.
Right.
Not in the service of meeting your own needs.
Yourself. Exactly. Precisely.
When there are so many former cult members who are mental health professionals now, which is wonderful. And whenever I get a call from somebody who's in training, who's come out of a cult or who has an interest because they had a family member or just because they're interested, I always say to them, get as broad and general an education in psychotherapy as you can.
Yep.
And you can specialize that's great. It's
Sure.
that's fine. We need more mental health professionals who are called to wear, but you need to have a good broad background in psychotherapy so that when you see a symptom, you don't automatically say, well, that comes from your being in the cult, that you can recognize the nuanced difference between somebody who had the experience in the cult and are therefore displaying something versus somebody that might have had that issue before, and you can explore both.
Yeah.
Again, I'm all in favor of specialized training. I think it's wonderful that this field is exploding in terms of that. But a broad general training is just as valuable.
Yep, totally. Yeah, so I guess I want to open up. Is there any other? So one question I did want you to cover, because this was something that I didn't see in the beginning of my career, and that shifted. Was I was recruited at 19, but I started seeing people who were born in cults or raised early on.
Going to talk about
Talk about the differences in doing work with people raised and born in cults versus recruited later.
So after about 30 years, around 2000, maybe a little before that, I began to see more and more people who were born and raised in cults. And this was a very different phenomenon than those people who had gone into cults. Most of those people seem to be suffering from complex PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
They, came from an experience typically where their parents' first alignment was with the cult leader.
Yep.
And the cult leader directed the family practices, the way that the parents should raise the children.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, with that, there was no sensitivity to children's needs, none. And many of the parents were afraid to show too much affection or attachment to their children. And a lot of the cult leaders even demanded that the children go to special schools away from the family. I worked with a woman who her cult was demanding that her child go away to school at age 5. And
sometimes to another country like India or something, right?
Right. And she left the cult. But a lot of parents couldn't do that. And it was a horrible thing because in these schools, they were away from their parents, or even if they were living with their parents, the days they spent with other adults, usually the adults were not trained in how to deal with children, and attitudes were harsh. And
Not to mention corporal punishment in some cases, where
punishment,
whips, paddles, belts,
sexual abuse as
covered
well.
up. Mm-hmm.
So much trauma for this group of people. And so I realized that I'm going to have to work with those that come out of cults in a whole different way. And because it was trauma that I was working with, although, it was well past my time in graduate school and my psychoanalytic training, I knew that I had to get an education in working with trauma. And that's what I've done in these last years, to learn more and more in this area, to understand, the way that children will, when they're in overwhelming experiences of a sense of abandonment or a sense of abuse, they'll check out and dissociate.
Mm-hmm.
because children have to go on living in the atmosphere that they're in.
Yep.
So on the outside, they might look like good, compliant children that have it all together. But inside, all those anxieties, overwhelming anxieties, and their paranoia, they're all held inside because they've learned you can't cause trouble in a cult, because what will happen to a child who causes trouble? You'll get abused in some ways, you'll be treated harshly. So they act like little soldiers for the most part. Now, I'm generalizing. This might not be true of every child that's raised in these circumstances, but certainly I had to deal with a lot of young adults that were dealing with this. So by the time they turn 18, 19, this has been like living in an authoritarian regime, and they want out. And we work with the ones that have left. And so, we're dealing with the after effects and so when you're working in therapy with people who have been traumatized in their younger years, it's not even just talk therapy anymore.
Right.
You're having to pick up somatic signs of dissociation, of tuning out. There will be times that they'll be touched. Something in their present life will remind them of something in the past.
What's
And
known as
so
triggers.
triggers, and for many, their anxieties will become sky high. They'll, really be reacting in extreme ways. And so emotional regulation becomes a big part of therapy, helping those people that are overwhelmed by the present come to see how they're being triggered about past memories and getting to those past memories or experiences.
Yep.
To separate the present from the past.
Yeah, and teaching them emotions are not evil, negative emotions, teaching them your body is not evil, and that if you have physical feelings that you should listen to your body and not just suppress what's going on in your body. But also, like, what's normal or what's healthy, because a lot of the people that I meet, maybe even their family's still in the cult and they're out and they've lost their whole family of origin, and they're looking for role models of, like, what's a father supposed to act like. They'd have no clue, or a mother, and explaining that a good parent wants to nurture their child, make them feel special, help them feel safe, just basic psychoeducation. And they're like, I want that.
Yeah.
And
there are ways that they can learn about that, and learning also through the therapeutic relationship. It is a relationship. And my job as a therapist is helping them to get attuned to the feelings that are underneath all of their defenses, and learning about themselves in that way, and learning how they came to be the way that they are, and getting emotionally connected to those times that they are experiencing powerful emotions. There's a beautiful video with Peter Fonagy on YouTube that I have people watch, that shows how through mentalization he connects with children, or how a parent can connect to the feelings.
in the blog, we'll put links to any resources you'd like to recommend to your listeners and such. There are a lot of great therapeutic approaches I've come across in my 40 years. I like Peter Levine's work, Waking the Tiger, Bessel van der Kolk body keeps the score. There's a bunch of different frames.
Fisher. There were
Yes.
a lot of good people that really, reading their work and listening to them online has really helped me, understand that this is a different kind of work.
Yep, indeed. So we only have a few minutes left, but I'd love to hear your wisdom on what's happening right now in the United States and the world, and if you have any advice to the general public, who knows, maybe someone from political persuasion with actual influence might listen. Like, what would you say? I mean, I have my talking points, about the need for more research, the need for more training, the need for more preventive education, epidemiological studies to show the scope of harm to the public. But tell me what your thoughts are about what's going on.
I cannot allow myself to be pessimistic about the future in our political system, only because I cannot allow myself to be pessimistic about the future. I'm
with you.
But
there's no option. We have to have hope, and we have to work our butt off.
But we have we're a petri dish in our country right now of conspiracy theories and hero worship and people giving up their critical minds because something sounds good, like the cult of Trump that you've written about.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that the whose camp you're in is more important than what the truth is. And I think we have got to recognize and call out leaders that are demagogic and play on people's emotions and play on people's prejudices. We have a responsibility to our country. So I think, unfortunately, our studies haven't stopped the tide that's going on in our country of so many people believing in conspiracy theories and getting involved in the cult of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
But thank God we have theoreticians and academics and book writers and the like who call this out so that it can explain what's going on in our society. We can work with individuals who have fallen down the rabbit hole and are following absurdities. We can work with groups to try to help them to see what's going on. We have to come to grips in our society with a very different phenomenon than we've had in the past. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Steve, when you said that the internet has a lot to do with it. People who are involved with QAnon, for example, their cult leader is an algorithm. And it's a different phenomenon. The biggest change that's happened, let's say, in the last 10 years in terms of the cultic field is the introduction of computer cults and the idea that you can be in your camp and be loaded with information, all of which is skewed and all of which has been manipulated on screen rather than an individual. When we first started out, I used to talk about the charismatic person and group dynamics, all of which still exist. But then there was a new phenomenon that's been added, which is the algorithms that keep people speculating on the truth about our society, in quotes, and again, how they can be manipulated, even videos can show
Can radicalize people to the left or the right.
well, and can show lies. You can make it seem as if somebody is saying something.
You can do deep fakes now for free.
Right, exactly.
Yourself. You don't even need a big company to do a deep fake video.
So we really have to get the word out to society as a whole for people to continue as much as possible to be skeptical. When you hear something is just what you want to believe and just fits in with your preconceived notions, you've got to be twice as skeptical about it. I always say that to my students. Whenever you hear something that just fits and it just makes you feel so good because it shows how the other team are idiots, you've got to stop and look at where that information is coming from and make sure it's a credible source. And you've got to be willing to acknowledge that there's no black and white, even though things can be presented that way, and that you've got to be willing to change your perspective.
Yeah, and have two credible sources before you share something. Because if it's true, it will be covered by credible, trustworthy.
And I think the key word in what you just said, Steve, is credible sources.
Right.
Is this a source that acknowledges that there's another point of view and looks at it and studies that? Or is this a source that only gives you one point of view and only propagandizes?
Yep. I want to ask you, Lorna, I saw you nodding with your husband. Any other thoughts that you'd like to share about what's happening now and any recommendations?
No, but I am aware that, I guess I'm saying yes after I said no. The impact on the people that I'm working with, the disruptions of the pandemic and the fears. I remember last summer, I was well aware that a lot of the people that I work with would have liked to go out and protest after the Floyd killing.
Yeah.
And former cult members, a lot of them were afraid to go out maybe, or they're also afraid to pick up a cause.
Yeah.
Because of the harm that a cause that their parents might have picked up caused them and how it impacted their lives. So
that's a very good, important point, actually. The fear to trust and make a commitment is a big long-term theme with people who've been abused, the way your brother was and the way I was. And part of it is learning to trust yourself, having a toolbox for analyzing and scrutinizing, having a support system that you can use for reality testing to make sure you don't get into any rabbit holes too deep, but trust is really important. I do want to, we're running out of time. I do want to come back to an important thing that I kind of came to about 5-6 years ago, and that was the realization that after so many years of activism, nothing was changing, like structurally. And I realized the law itself is out of date, about 80 to 100 years for what we now know about the human mind and human behavior and neuroscience. And so I got involved with this forensic think tank at Harvard Medical School, and they told me I should go get a doctorate and go do a quantitative study on my bite model. And I was like, I'm 63. What are you talking? And they're like, we're 76. We're, 82. What do you want to change the law or don't? You got to, if you want to do it, you got to do it. You got to do the work. So I did that, and I know, Bill, that you've done expert witness work. I'm not sure, Lorna, if you have, but could you say a few words about the law and what we might be able to do to change it, to adapt to what we now know?
One of the good things about the our movement is the people that are coming in. We have the a wealth of expertise of people that didn't exist when you started in your journey in this field and when we started in our journey. There were some people that Lorna mentioned that were giants whose shoulders we stood on, but they were few and far between. Now there's much more research going on, and the fact is that if you have a conflict between science and politics, you have politics. That's what's going to.
Yeah.
It's always been the case. The phenomenon has been throughout history, but the way it plays out is new. And I think that we do have to recognize that certain things exist that we didn't recognize before. Things like mind control, things like cultism, things like undue influence that goes beyond taking a person with dementia and influencing them, but taking a person who's normal and healthy and has normal and healthy impulses and how they can be manipulated.
Right.
I think we have to come to grips with that as a society. How we're going to do that, I think we have to continue to go back to school, continue to be credentialed, continue to do studies. And eventually, I started out, the first thing I said was, I'm an optimist because I have to be an optimist, because I don't want to get caught up in the pessimistic view of society.
And you have a child and grandchildren, and you want the planet to survive. Like, there's no option.
You know, I was very taken with Alan Shefflin's remark when he, in your interview with him, which was such an excellent interview, Steve, when he said, people don't want to believe in the malleability of the human mind. And that is so true. All of us don't want to think that we can be influenced. But now neuroscience has said the brain is plastic.
Right.
And
that was different when I was starting out.
Right.
Yes.
There was
no new brain cells,
right,
and they all die out.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
But with that, we're seeing also that relationships and therapeutic relationships can really make a difference.
Yeah, resiliency.
Will change.
I actually got smarter doing my doctoral program. I had to. I was reading these books. I had to think through these abstract thoughts, and I feel younger in my brain.
Absolutely.
The old use it or lose it is really true. And resiliency is a feature. I want to ask you one last question. It may not be the last because we may have 4 minutes, but I get asked this all the time, but you've been doing this even longer than me. People ask me, Steve, you deal with so much trauma and so many people with pain, and how do you keep doing it day after day and year after year? How come you didn't burn out? What do you say when people ask you?
Oh, you know what I find working in this area is the most satisfying area that we could work in because of what we're talking about now, the resiliency of people. And the thing is, when you're working with a let's say a first generation person.
Yeah.
Working with a first generation person, once they understand what happened to them, they very quickly reconstitute. And
I want to interrupt and just say first generation for our listeners means like me, recruited at 19 versus second generation, someone raised in a cult. Forgive me for interrupting you.
And the other thing is when you work with those that have been particularly traumatized, although first generation people have been traumatized too, of course, but when you work with second and multi-generational young adults, that once they discover, the key to what is going on with them, the changes are amazing. So that is what keeps us going, really, seeing people do better all the
Right.
time.
Yeah, exactly. I am your pupils on a certain level, and I echo that. And what you said earlier, Bill, about learning from your clients, like every case is an opportunity to grow and learn, expand your perspectives on things, and it just but you also need to take time out and do self-care, because that's another thing ex-cult members need to learn. I was working 18 to 21 hours a day, and at first I thought it was selfish for me to sleep in.
Because you still had that mindset.
Exactly.
You didn't have a right to do for yourself.
Exactly. It would be selfish to go back to college and finish my degree. And it's like, wait a minute.
Right.
And all of that. So thank you for being you. Thank you for your hearts, your minds, your dedication, your compassion, your activism. You should feel really good, in my opinion, that you've helped so many people and they go out and help others. I'm certainly one of your people. So I wanted to capture you on video while you're still practicing, while we're still in this critical historical moment. And we want to inspire more people to get involved and inspire more people who are former members who maybe haven't been talking about the fact that they had been in a cult 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
And make it normal. Like, let's destigmatize it and be like, hey, join the human race.
Right. Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you so much. And we'll stay in touch.
Very good.
Continued success.
Take care.
Okay. Bye.